My presentation is about, as I said, the Finnish-born psychiatrist and psychoanalyst Benjamin Rubinstein. Well, he was born in Helsinki. Here are some photos from family albums. Here he was called also Penny, Penny, Ben, and his mother Rico, here born Pergament. They were a Swedish-speaking Finnish-Jewish family with ties to Poland and Russia. So quite, multicultural family. Here you can see him in the United States when he was already working as a psychoanalyst there. And here's a very good photo. His wife Dina Rubinstein was a professional photographer, and here you can see Benjamin Rubinstein at home in New York in 1980. Here you can see his a lively way of talking. So here are a couple of issues from his career. As I said, he was born in Helsinki and then died in New York in 1989. Before the Second World War, he had been in analysis in London by Eva Rosenfeld, not so very well-known analyst, but actually Eva Rosenfeld knew very well the Freuds and also Melanie Klein. So Rubinstein got some basic knowledge about Kleinian thinking. He fought in the Finnish army. That was a strange thing. He had a Jewish background, and he was fighting at the end of the war in cooperation with Germany. So that's a very strange episode. Finns didn't give any Jews to concentration camps, and they wanted to secure the Jewish population, but there was some collaboration at the end of the war against Russia, and the Finns had to have collaboration with Hitler's Germany. It's a very strange historical situation. Well, after the Second World War, Benjamin stayed in Helsinki. He specialized in urology and psychiatry, and he is also a kind of pioneer among the Finnish psychiatrists, because he gave impulses to younger colleagues toward psychoanalytic training. But then he didn't stay in Finland, moved permanently in 1947 to the USA. He went first to Topeka, that famous Menninger clinic, and this Carl Menninger, one of the Menninger brothers, was Rubinstein's training analyst and a supervisor. But there was a conflict between Carl Menninger and Rubinstein in Topeka because Rubinstein wrote a theoretical work criticizing Freud's sexual theory and drive energy concept, and Rubinstein insisted that psychoanalytic clinical theory should inevitably be bound to neurophysiology. He started his main ideas already then. I'll come back to them a bit later. Now, Carl Menninger held Rubinstein's work to be very offensive and arrogant, and he felt a kind of personal insult and Rubinstein was so I think he was so surprised that his training analyst was so aggressive, and he planned then to leave for New York. And Menninger had, I think, raised Rubinstein as his gifted analytic son, but this son suddenly disappeared. And Menninger labeled Rubinstein as a traitor, packed with, I quote, narcissism, unanalyzed issues, and so on. So, and he said quite rudely that Rubinstein is lacking insight. And he went to extremes by circulating a rumor that Rubinstein was paranoid. And he managed to delay Rubinstein's acceptance to the American Psychoanalytic Association. But finally, Rubinstein was accepted in to the New York Psychoanalytic Society in 1954 it was, and he started his private practice in New York, continued it until his death in 1989, and published important articles that were posthumously collected to his large work, Psychoanalysis and Philosophy of Science. Here's my short article about Rubinstein, published in Clio's Psyche a couple of years ago. Then I go to his contributions. He is a significant representative of the philosophy of psychoanalysis and a critic of psychoanalytic metapsychology. That is a kind of basic thing in his work. And he also co-founded with Robert Holt, George Klein, and Emanuel Peter Freund the interdisciplinary annual Psychoanalysis and Contemporary Science, which also published, by the way, articles on psychohistory and psychobiography. He was a kind of early predecessor even of present-day neuropsychoanalysis, because he emphasized that the psychoanalytic concepts must not conflict with the results of the neurophysiological studies. There are three themes that I would like to here focus on, or give you a kind of short idea. First, that the nature of the unconscious from the perspective of the mind-body problem. Then the relationship of the clinical theory of psychoanalysis to other scientific theories. And third, the specific nature of the psychoanalytic concepts and hypotheses. In the first issue, Rubinstein mentioned in certain passages that he is a monist. So philosophically, that means that he considered all mental things, whether they are emotions or mental images, to be aspects of matter. So it's a idea that these should be reduced to material things. Well, he had his position a kind of relativization of this monism. He said that it is best so far not to commit to any particular solution to the mind-body problem. So it's a philosophical problem, but in psychoanalytic practice, you don't need to have a very distinct solution to this problem. That is a kind of, practical attitude by Rubinstein. So Rubinstein was very familiar with brain research, And he thus emphasized that concepts that explain human activity must be linked to neurophysiology. He thought that rational psychological concepts always have their counterparts in the brain. And from these starting points, he concludes that the talk of, for example, repressed desires ultimately refers only to the states of the brain. Thus, the concept of desire is for him a set of behavioral dispositions that have a neural basis, and that's it, that's all. So this is a very minimalist attitude. But Rubinstein challenges us to say, what else then desire is? Please tell it to him. And he was very interested in the ways of talking in psychoanalytic practice and psychoanalytic theory. And here I give you some basic ideas of his way of depicting two ways of talking in psychoanalysis. First, there's a person view, and the second is an organism view. And these supplement one another. The former, the person view, is typical of psychoanalytic clinical theories and practice, and the latter, the organism view, is typical of the natural sciences and psychoanalytic metapsychology. This term metapsychology is quite abstract, but I will explain it shortly. In psychoanalysis, it means that Freud formulated a dynamic, a drive, economic, and topographical theory of the psyche. So this metapsychology is far removed from empirical reality. It also includes, for example, the fiction of the psychic apparatus with its different agencies, and it includes the theory of the drives and repression. This is a psychoanalytic metapsychology. Now, Rubinstein proposed that it is possible to be both a materialistic scientist and an experienced realistic psychotherapist at the same time. This is a kind of compromise. Now, Rubinstein stressed that the clinical findings and theories of psychoanalysis need to be linked to a broader context, which he called extra-clinical theory. For Rubinstein, Freud's metapsychology that I just shortly described is one example of extraclinical theories. In the 1970s, that is a very good period for Rubinstein's literary production. In the 1970s, Rubinstein showed fundamental problems in psychoanalytic metapsychology, together with American other analysts, for example, Holt, Peter Freund, George Klein, Roy Schaffer, Alan Rosenblatt, James Dickstone. John Geddo, who wrote about Rubinstein, even sees Rubinstein as the chief architect of that American critique of psychoanalytic metapsychology. Now, to explain the theme critique of metapsychology, it's not really aimed at totally abandoning metapsychology. It criticizes certain problem areas of Freud's metapsychology, and the American analysts longed for better metapsychology. And indeed, Rubinstein states, without some kind of metapsychology, much of clinical psychoanalysis would shrink to play with words. So Adolf Grünbaum was perhaps the most critical advocate of discarding whole metapsychology. And he cited Freud himself, who wrote that metapsychology is a, I quote, is a speculative superstructure that can be abandoned or changed without loss. So this is the end quote from Freud. Actually, Grünbaum meant that metapsychology has no contribution to clinical theories, but this was a very extreme view, and Rubinstein and many others didn't subscribe this view. In his own extraclinical reflection, Rubinstein relies heavily on brain research, as I said, neurophysiology, but he also applies the research findings of the cognitive orientation to the psychoanalytic questions. Thus, extraclinical theory can consist of perspectives from neurophysiology, experimental psychology, philosophy, or artificial intelligence research. Clinical practices of psychoanalysis can have different collaborations, routes, and these practices should therefore seek to anchor research in different branches of cognitive science or cognitive neuroscience. And perhaps nowadays Rubinstein would have been in favor of affective neuroscience too, but he didn't yet grasp that area. Now I go to another interesting philosophical question about the nature of the psychoanalytic hypotheses. Here I refer to Rubinstein, who thought that interpretations presented to the patients or analysants in psychoanalysis are detailed, particular clinical hypotheses. They are related to a specific situation of that particular person who is in analysis. But then at a hierarchically higher cognitive level of abstraction, there are special clinical hypotheses and general clinical hypotheses. Both of these hypotheses are further divided by Rubinstein into motivational, situational, genetic, that means developmental, and other hypotheses. For example, a special situational hypothesis may be the assumption that in a certain situation people tend to become traumatized. That's a quite abstract issue there, this hypothesis. Then according to the general motivational hypothesis, on the other hand, all activity is motivated. So it's a very heavy generalization, and we can call it general clinical hypothesis. Some more things, this way, some more issues about psychoanalytic hypotheses. In practice, psychoanalysts and those who work in the field of psychotherapeutic practice, they don't usually have these kinds of philosophical assumptions of different kinds of hypotheses. And Rubinstein claimed that clinical, from the point of view of philosophy, they are these psychoanalytic hypotheses, they are probabilistic. They are not any universal laws of nature. Even the seemingly universal, but in fact loose claim that all behavior is motivated contains probability. So it's probabilistic, for we don't know for sure what motivates every aspect of all behavior or its consequences. However, Rubinstein speculated that clinical hypotheses may be real scientific hypotheses referring to hitherto unknown processes. And psychoanalytic theory would need a more categorical description of these hypotheses. That's Rubinstein's idea. But then he admits, as I said, that psychoanalysts in practice don't use these hierarchies. They don't outline their work with the solution that he proposed. But he made an attempt to structure the field of psychoanalytic hypotheses, and I think his attempt can benefit from a study of the fundamentals of psychoanalysis. It's impossible to have any sensible discussion about the scientificity and correctness of psychoanalysis unless the nature of the psychoanalytic hypothesis is clear. And this is the theme that Adolf Grünbaum focused on in his well-known critique of psychoanalysis. I now give some points from the friends, this circle of friends, Rubinstein's friends. Brian, can you tell me how much time do I have? I don't have a clock now here.
Oh, you've been speaking for, let's see, almost a half hour. So you think you can do it in 10 minutes?
Yeah, I will do it in 10 minutes. Yeah, and
okay,
then
great.
we have time for discussion. That's good. So there's a circle of friends and colleagues in the US, and this circle included Adolf Grünbaum, psychologist Robert Holt. Can you believe he is still living, over 100 years old? Psychologist, psychoanalyst George Klein, and psychiatrist, psychoanalyst Emanuel Peter Freund. Those were the closest friends, and they all reformed psychoanalytic theories by including current scientific research and models, while also reflecting on how to advance sensitive and innovative psychoanalytic practice that applies flexible and interdisciplinary approaches. I stress this flexible and interdisciplinary approaches. Then some personal descriptions, how these friends described Rubinstein's contributions. Adolf Grünbaum even dedicated his magnum opus, The Foundations of Psychoanalysis. It was published in 1984 to Rubinstein. And this is from a personal letter that we got with my colleague from Adolf Grünbaum in 2006. He told us that he respected Ben Rubinstein immensely and was also very fond of him, although I never knew why he had thought that Melanie Klein had contributed something worthwhile to psychoanalysis. So it explains that Rubinstein was in London, very close to Melanie Klein and her circle. Then Morris Eagle, also one of the great names in American psychoanalysis, and the author of the introduction to the collected papers of Rubinstein, says Rubinstein was very intelligent and intellectually extremely honest. Eagle thinks Rubinstein was even too intellectual and open-minded to fit the prevailing psychoanalytic order, and especially the old guard, as I explained, the Menninger brothers and their charismatic and impetuous things about psychoanalytic order and how it should be theorized. Then this grand old man, Robert Holt, he has edited Rubinstein's collected papers, and he says in the preface to that collected papers that Rubinstein was the finest psychoanalytic theorist of his time. Holt also gave an interview where he characterizes more his relationship to Rubinstein's thinking, and I quote here next this Holt's characterization. This is very interesting. One of the many ways in which Benjamin Rubinstein influenced the work of the Research Center for Mental Health, well, he was attached to that New York Center for a while, influenced the work of the Research Center for Mental Health for the better, was his constant insistence that metapsychology could not simply be abolished. It needed to be replaced, and he strongly advocated what he called a proto-neurophysiological substitute, one that was consistent with contemporary knowledge in the brain sciences while being stated in psychological terms. And there is Holt's confession: only belatedly, when working on his collected papers, did I realize the extent to which my own critical evaluation of Freud's theories was based on Rubinstein's pioneering work, now published in that book, meaning Psychoanalysis and the Philosophy of Science, collected papers of Benjamin Rubinstein. And this is interesting. These friends give quite high respect, and Holt has also told that Rubinstein was very often rejected in psychoanalytic journals, and he even received unusually rude comments from the gatekeepers of those journals. Given that, according to Rubinstein, psychoanalytic core concepts such as the ego, id, superego, unconscious desire, and psychic energy are only theoretical concepts. The evaluators or gatekeepers' attitudes may not be very surprising. Then to Everett Linder, who is a relative, Rubinstein's relative, Rubinstein stated his personal view of the American way of living in the 1980s. And he also said something about psychoanalysis that treats what is not known. And then he added to Linder, although I'm a psychoanalyst, I think that perhaps one day the physiological and biochemical background of the conditions to be treated will be found and placed in the order of the molecules. So there's the new program for psychoanalysis. And here, lastly, some personal descriptions. Rubinstein's anti-establishment stance must be mentioned. His atheism and cosmopolitanism. Everett Linder, his relative, has told about that. And Everett Linder also remembers Rubinstein's driving a car in a traffic jam in New York, saying, life in New York makes it clear that Marxism is a goal that should be achieved, but which cannot be reached here. That was a very typical saying by Rubinstein. He was not touched by Jewish religion or Jewish ritualism, although he appreciated the long Jewish spiritual tradition. Michael Sheinin, one of his relatives, mentions Rubinstein's no-nonsense attitude, which was as far away as possible from paranoia, conspiracy theories, and American-style self-marketing.